We now have a more clear view of why Washington State and Oregon State didn't get the invite to the Big 12. And what it starts with is revenue numbers. This is per Jeff Fuller, who's done a great job of taking the EADA surveys over the last 20 years and putting together grand total athletic revenue, showing that Kansas is pushing nearly $2 billion over the course of the last 2 decades, and they are number one in the Big 12. Let me read you the 5 most profitable schools, the schools with the best revenue over the course of those 20 years. Kansas at 1, Oklahoma State 2, TCU 3, Arizona State 4, and Baylor 5. This again per the EADA website. That's ope.ed.gov, the literal U.S. government. EADA, per Fuller, lists data for all schools, including private schools, and it's worth noting that some revenue is in the form of direct institutional support and or student fees from many schools. So now we've established the 5 best teams for like U.S. government, 5 highest grossing revenue teams: Kansas, Oklahoma State, TCU, Arizona State, and Baylor. Let's see why Washington State and Oregon State didn't make it into the Big 12. That's because Oregon State is sitting at $1.2 billion over the course of the last 20 years. That is 61st nationally. And Washington State is at just over $1 billion, $1.08 billion, which was dead last amongst all Power 5 schools. Here's the really, really tough news to swallow if you're Oregon State and Washington State. Most of this, at least a portion of this, was based on timing. The Big 12 showed that it wanted to go out west with adding BYU, even Utah, Arizona State. But Houston, Cincinnati, UCF in the last 2 decades, and I'll withhold UCF a bit there for obvious reason. Houston and Cincinnati, those 2 programs made less than $1 billion over the last 20 years. Oregon State, I already told you, made $1.2 billion, almost 1.3. Washington State made $1 billion. Almost $1.1 billion. That is still a significant gap over Houston and Cincinnati. Those 2 programs would have likely been much more valuable. Now, I know they were in the Pac-12. You'd argue if Houston and Cincinnati had been Pac-12 teams or Power 5 teams, they would have made more money. And that case is true, but we know from a TV viewership standpoint, Washington State blows Houston and Cincinnati out of the water. Had all of this gone down a couple of years prior, before Houston and Cincinnati were here, there's a legitimate chance that Washington State and Oregon State are Big 12 teams because of what they have done, not just from a TV viewership standpoint, but also a revenue standpoint. Now, it's not good. I mean, Washington State's not good. That is last amongst Power 5 teams. That's not I don't need that, right? You're taking a chance on Cincinnati and Houston to build something up, but they're still significantly less. Again, in a Power 5 conference, those schools have made more money, and they're doing real well for being schools that aren't or weren't Power 5 for 20 years. But Washington State's viewership numbers and the way that Kirk Schultz, the university president, carried Oregon State along with the university in expansion talks shows there is a legitimate possibility, had the timeline been different, that both of them would have got an invite to the Big 12. Instead, what Brett Yormark ended up doing was balking on those 2, saying, hey, go play your fun new league that you're going to build yourself. And kind of wild, too, that he said no to Gonzaga and UConn in the basketball-only format. And instead decided to focus on the ACC. Like, that's what's next, is further Big 12 expansion with schools that are profitable on the East Coast. I truly believe that is where Brett Yormark is taking his focus, and adding Washington State and Oregon State when, at the time being last summer, when he could have, didn't make sense enough. And those 2 schools were barred out of what they were guaranteed in college football playoff conversations about how the ACC, Pac-12, Big 12, anybody who goes defunct still has a leeway or grace period. That was, in essence, thrown out by the College Football Playoff Committee, and both teams got a raw deal in the revenue numbers they could have gotten. That still wasn't enough, and none of that was enough to get them to the Big 12. I will mention, too, I told you Kansas 1, Oklahoma State 2, TCU 3, Arizona State 4. This is in revenue over the last 20 years. And Baylor at 5. I'll give you the rest of the list. 6, Arizona. 7, West Virginia. 8, Colorado. That's your top 8 most profitable, highest revenue grossing teams over the last 2 decades. Then the back half. Kansas State at 9, Texas Tech 10, Iowa State 11, Utah 12. Again, another school that spent some time in the group of 5, but TCU, they were a group of 5 team there for a little bit. They're third, remember, in athletic revenue. So that's just a nugget to keep in your back pocket. BYU, UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati make up the back end. But again, I think that kind of goes back to talking about how Houston and Cincinnati, of course, their numbers are less because they weren't a Power 5 school, but TCU wasn't a Power 5 school either. And they still, not for the full 20 years, and they still are sitting at $1.5 billion, which is third in the Big 12. They have done a whole lot of good, no matter where they are over college football. And most of this revolves around college football, though Kansas being one in total athletic revenue has much to do with basketball. I can guarantee you that. So if you're an elite team, a Kansas type, they had 07 too in football. Your numbers could be pretty beefy. So you guys have fun? Overlooking a great, beautiful baseball park here in Mesa, Arizona. To the Grand Canyon this week. Isn't that nice? I had a lot of fun with it. I hope you had a good week too. Come back tomorrow. I won't be here Saturday tomorrow. Come back on Monday. We'll talk more, what do you say? Big 12? This has been. It always will be. Not on. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.